This is Charlotte Talks. I'm Mike Collins. On the local news roundup, CMPD Chief Kerr Putney had his retirement and his return all planned out, but the state says those plans may not fly. Charlotte has its own whistleblower raising questions about former CMS Superintendent Clayton Wilcox. Some Republicans speak out against President Trump's Syria decision, but North Carolina Senator Thom Tillis stands by his man. And as former Governor Pat McCrory cries hypocrisy over the NBA's capitulation to the Chinese, the Panthers look east to London, England, for their next game on Sunday morning. Our roundtable of reporters is ready to detail those and other stories, and those reporters include Andos Helms, education reporter from WFAE News. Hello, hello.
Good morning.
Jonathan Lowe is reporter anchor for Spectrum News. Welcome back.
Good morning, Mike.
Nick Oxner's been away for most of the summer on a luxurious vacation, no doubt. He's a reporter for WBTV News. Welcome.
That's me, all vacation all the time.
And Eric Spanberg is managing editor of the Charlotte Business Journal. Good to see you, too.
Good morning, Mike.
We're all on the radio. We're also on Facebook Live this morning. Yesterday, the contractor building the toll lanes on I-77 asked for yet another extension to finish the project. This could push completion, which was supposed to have been finished this year, into next year.
When are we going to get to the point that the state stands up and has some spine on this and says, okay, enough is enough. Either finish it or you're going to pay.
Michelle Ferlato, that's who that is. She's a longtime toll lane critic. She doesn't want to see the state grant the delay. Why are they asking for one? What's the holdup?
That's the big question, Mike. That has yet to be answered. The two questions, how long they need for this extension and the reason for it. Neither NCDOT nor I-77 Mobility Partners have answered that question.
I-77 Mobility Partners is the subsidiary of Cintra, the
Correct.
Spanish company that they've given the rights to build and run this thing for 50 years. They've been building this road for 4 years. The first leg opened 5 months late, I think, this year.
Correct. Supposed to open in January, originally.
And they had until November the 1st to finish the rest or face a $10,000 a day fine for any unopened sections. Two Democratic state lawmakers, both from northern Mecklenburg County, State Senator Natasha Marcus and State Representative Christy Clark, have asked NCDOT Secretary James Trogdon not to approve the extension. If he doesn't, what then? What are the consequences?
It's $10,000 a day fine, right?
Yes.
If it's not granted, that's in the contract.
And they've still sort of left it open that they might kind of come close to meeting the deadline, but they're also saying, well, we need more time. You know, and last time they got the extension, there were reasons for it. They had been asked to do additional work, so they could say it's reasonable. This time they just kind of seem to be saying, if we don't meet the deadline, would you please just not fine us?
Well, what I wonder is whether they're going to get into those other repairs to, you know, they did some access work and they're doing some work on the non-toll lanes, which was the reason they were not fined for pushing this from January to November. I don't know.
They were asked to do extra work.
Right. I don't know if they're going to be able to say that again.
Yeah, but if you drive the portion, so the northern portion, just to be clear, the northern portion of the toll lanes, it's 26 miles from Hambright Road to all the way up to Morrisville is open. But even with that, one of the complaints that we're still hearing, and if you drive it, there are uneven lanes. So you're driving down where they have paved, you know, a nice surface in one lane. You know, people are constantly changing lanes, and if you have maybe a 2, 3 inch, 4 inch dip, it really jerks your car. And so I'm wondering, we don't have that answer yet, but I'm wondering if that has something to do with it. The direct connectors, which is what was the reason for the first delay, that was something that was added by DOT. Those appear to be almost complete.
But if you drive this stretch of it, from say the John Belk up to 85,
correct,
there's no way they're going to finish that by November.
Yeah, because they're building a lot of different bridges and interchanges. Right. I mean, it's a huge interchange. They're still working on the noise walls because there are a lot of neighborhoods that back up to that portion right there by 277.
So let's back up. I know they asked him to do extra work. That delayed him a little bit. Did we have really bad weather or something that prevented them from working a lot of the time?
That's one of the big points that Senator Natasha Marcus brought up yesterday when I talked to her. She said, you know, I could understand if we've had a really wet summer, but we're in a drought. almost a severe drought. So she's
Bad
like,
for farmers, but great for construction.
exactly. This is the
Apparently
kind
not.
of weather where they get the most done, according to her. So she's like, I just don't see any sort of reason for why they need this extension.
Recall, Mike, that when this deal was closed eons ago, right after I got to the market, I've known nothing other than I-77 controversy as being a reporter in Charlotte. This contract was the whole deal was closed months and months ahead of time, and this is maybe the result of rushed planning. Is you don't consider
Imagine
that. Shocking, right?
Well, and remember when they started construction, that's a good point, Nick. Remember they started construction, and a lot of people said, well, they're just starting this in a rush so that it doesn't get kiboshed, in essence, or it can't be delayed by all the fighting.
So it's my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, that when they finish this, when this is done and put away in a nice little box, they're going to start on the southern leg. Is that right?
And that's
To
one
the-
of
to the state line.
I believe so, and that's one of the big concerns that drivers that I talked to last night. They said, it feels like this is never going to be over, that they're going to finish this 26-mile portion,
Right.
and that there's always going to be some sort of construction that's going to carry on just to accrue more revenue.
Have they decided who will build the southern portion from Charlotte to
No.
South Carolina?
I don't
They
even
have
think,
not.
do they have funding for that project?
Well, it's not on our show topic today, but DOT has funding for no projects right now. So
That'd be a no.
or employees.
But there is a $900 million surplus. I just want to point that out. Okay, let's move along
Absolutely.
because he talked about plans maybe going awry. We've known for a while that CMPD Chief Kerr Putney had planned to retire following the Republican National Convention in Charlotte next summer. But this week, he emerged from a closed-door session with the Charlotte City Council with a new plan.
January 1 of 2020, I am going to officially retire through the state system. In normal fashion, just like everybody else, though, I'm not quite done.
He wasn't quite done with the job, nor with his retirement plan.
I'm coming back after about 30 days or so, and we're going to execute what we've started. We got to finish it. I want you to know that come September 1st, I'm going to really transition, truly retire, and move on to the next chapter.
So this unconventional plan was to retire, take 2 months off, come back on an interim basis as the chief through the convention. Was this his idea, or was this some compromise between him and the city and city planners and a city council that knew that he is, quote unquote, tired?
So
Go ahead.
Well, that's actually important to start with. When we were all in Austin last summer for the RNC meeting, there started being whispers, well, Chief Putney's going to retire before then. And I remember having conversations with some of those city officials. They're going, we don't know anything about that. And so I think Chief Putney's plan was to retire before the RNC, and the city said, whoa, please do not go.
Yep.
And
he
so
said that to me when he did a one-on-one interview last year. He did several. He did a round robin of one-on-one interviews, and he said, I asked him off camera, are you going to stay through RNC? And he was like, well, I got the time to retire, but he wants to keep his commitment to the city, I think. But he did make it clear to me that he had the time at that point to retire.
So who came up with the plan to
I'm
retire?
assuming, the city manager, because I think
Okay.
he had the chief has a lot of support both from city manager and the city council.
And they want him here through the convention because he was here for the DNC.
Correct. He has a
4
lot
years
of
ago, so
experience in that
He understands
area.
how it all works. So would it be correct to say that he expected to take his full retirement, stop work for 2 months, come back, continue to take that retirement, and then be paid at some salary level? Would it be his current salary level?
That is generally the scheme and this is not necessarily uncommon. Let's just dive into what the state treasurer's office says is illegal about this plan or against the law. Illegal makes it sound like he's committing a crime. This is just against some legal regulations.
Right.
The thing that he says you can't do is when you expressly say, I know I'm already coming back. And the law says you can't retire with a predetermined rehire date. And because he so explicitly said it, that's the problem.
And this is what state treasurer, Dale Falwell had to say.
Anytime that there is an intent to return to work, and when it's that well publicized, then, a retirement cannot go forward.
So do the lawyers not know this?
Well, it's important to note that this is a common practice for CMPD. I mean, they have their cold case unit that has brought, for instance, I know that there's been some reporting by some other local media, but we all know, we've done stories with for instance, their cold case unit. They have detectives. Daryl Stevens, I may have his name wrong, but he was a homicide detective back in the 90s, was really key on a lot of important cases.
And I think Gary McFadden, who's now the sheriff, was in that role for quite a long time.
They were brought back, and they've helped make some significant arrests, that cold case unit, because they have these retired officers that have come back. So it's not a new practice within CMPD, but as the state treasurer mentioned in that soundbite you played, this is a more high-profile
because
position.
evidently under state regulations, you can resume employment after 30 days, limited to 1,000 hours per year, but you can't announce that this is what you're going to do before you do it. You have to just do it.
And I think one difference is, A, it's high profile, and B, it's coming back to the same job. I think you see things like that where they come back in cold case. In the school system, you see administrators brought back as interim principals,
or
but you
consultants.
don't see a principal, let alone the superintendent, saying, I'm going to retire, I'm going to start getting my pension, and then I'm going to come back, collect my salary, and do this same job.
Here's another thing, though. We're talking about the high-profile nature of Putney, yes, but I think one of the important things that the state treasurer was telling all of us this week is that now they want to go back and look and see exactly how this was done and whether it jeopardizes. The whole concern here is IRS law rule requirement. And so that's what he's talking about. He's talking about a $6 billion benefit system that he's worried is endangered by having not just perhaps Chief Putney, but others in the past doing this.
So wouldn't ignorance be the best defense? Why do you want to go and dig through why do you want to dig through this to find out if other people have done this
Because
too?
now that you know they might be doing it, now you're on notice. And here's an important thing. Dale Falwell is a stickler for the rules. He's also very minded on saving as much money as possible. He turned around the State Employment Security Commission under the McCrory administration. He came into office as state treasurer after the 2016 election with the express goal of cutting money that we're paying where we don't need to be, and cutting waste and bloat. Okay. So the latest thing is, while the city says we're right, the treasurer says you can't do that. You know who has the retirement purse strings for Kerr Putney? The treasurer. So it doesn't really matter what the city says.
So is there a difference of opinion about the law or the regulation, which the state treasurer says has been in place now for 4 decades? Is there a difference of opinion between him, Dale Falwell, and the city attorneys?
Clearly,
yes,
but again,
yes.
Falwell wins because he's the one with the cash.
Yeah, because in that statement earlier this week, the city hasn't said much since then, but they did say they view the statute differently.
Well, let's go back to that for a minute, Mike, because it is a little bit
You
jarring.
only have a minute.
Okay, well, I'll say it very quickly. So they have all of this. The chief speaks. There's going to be a press conference on Wednesday to talk about this marvelous transition. Then the press conference is canceled. There's a statement on Tuesday, and that's really where the city has left it.
I have to ask a question. So you didn't use your full minute. The Observer reported that based on his salary, he would be eligible for a city-paid special separation allowance equivalent to 1/4 of his $220,000 salary, or $55,000, payable in monthly installments until the age of 62. How old is he?
50.
And he's retiring?
Apparently.
I'm making a note here. I want his job. If he retired before that time, before 62 with 30 years of service, he'd be eligible to receive that allowance in a lump sum of $600,000. He started on the force in 1992, so he's shy of 30 years. Was the lump sum the plan? Very quickly.
I don't think we know.
No, okay, we don't know. We have to take a break. There's more to come on the News Roundup. Stay with us at Charlotte Talks on WFAE. Support for Charlotte Talks comes from WFAE members and Carolina Bio-Oncology Institute, hosting clinical research trials for healthy volunteers for white blood cell donations to identify cellular immunotherapies. CarolinaBioOncology.org. And Gaston Day School, welcoming artists, inventors, storytellers, and big-picture thinkers. Gaston Day educates students preschool through grade 12. Information about open houses and personal campus visits at GastonDay.org. The Trump presidency always seems to be on the verge of a constitutional crisis, and we're there now with his administration's refusal to cooperate with the impeachment inquiry in the House. So at this point, it might be helpful to take a step back and look at the Constitution, to see what it has to say. In fact, a solid understanding of that document at all times would be good for us. And to that end, CBS News legal analyst Kim Whaley will talk about her book, How to Read the Constitution, on this program, Monday at 9.
Elizabeth Warren goes on offense, the NBA goes on defense, and the White House declares war on the impeachment inquiry. There's been a lot of big moves in the news this week, including Simone Biles, whose big moves made gymnastics history. We'll get to it all in the Friday News Roundup. That's next time on 1A.
The Roundup of the Week's news continues with 1A from 10 to noon, right after the Charlotte Talks Local News Roundup, here on 90.7 WFAE.
It's Charlotte Talks on listener-funded 90.7 WFAE and 90.3 WFHE. I'm Mike Collins. It's the local news roundup that explains Eric Spanberg being here. Well, he's here. Oh, he's always here. Eric Spanberg from the Charlotte.
I live in the
Business
closet.
Journal. You do. Nick Oxner from WBTV News, just always ready to go on at the drop of a hat. And Jonathan Lois here. He's a reporter anchor for Spectrum News, and Andos Helms is education reporter for WFAE. How propitious, because we're about to talk about education here. There are two whistleblowers making life miserable for Donald Trump in Washington, but not to be outdone, Charlotte has its own whistleblower, and this one is alleging a problem with former CMS Superintendent Clayton Wilcox and his son. What is the allegation?
Well, so first let me start by repeating something you said on an earlier show with investigative reporters. This is something that only newspapers can do, and that's why we need them. Annie Ma and Fred Kelly from the Charlotte Observer spent, I'm thinking, weeks, if not months, getting hundreds of pages of public records requests and trying to tease this out. And it's complicated, so I'm going to try to go through the timeline. Clayton Wilcox gets hired in 2017, starts in the summer, and shortly after that, he meets with executives from Fuel Education, which happens to be where his son Tanner works. And apparently, the whistleblower here is Brian Schultz, who was the chief academic officer during all this. Brian Schultz had concerns about this. According to this letter, at the end of this meeting, Wilcox said, well, yeah, my son works for Fuel Education, but don't worry, he's not going to personally benefit if we do a contract with them. So CMS does sign a contract, about $135,000 for digital language tool, even though CMS already had that in place. And this is kind of weird because...
From another company.
Right, another company. And one of the things that Clayton Wilcox said almost from the moment he arrived is CMS is bad about just piling on more and more programs and more vendors. And we never got him before he got pushed out to say what he was going to get rid of, but apparently there was something he wanted to add. I suppose they got rid of the other vendor. But so in February of 2018, shortly after this, Brian Schultz, who was at the time still working for CMS, wrote a letter to the board, and it said that Dr. Wilcox's relationship with vendors is of great concern to me in terms of jeopardizing the credibility of the district. And so we know that at least two board members, Rhonda Cheek and the board chair, Mary McRae, read that letter. They asked the district's legal department to review it, and the attorney for the district said it's not illegal. It doesn't represent a conflict of interest that violates our policy.
All right, hold on. The whistleblower comes forward in February of 2018.
Right.
Why are we just hearing about this now?
Well, I will say I had been hearing about this along with a whole mush of other things, not at the time that it happened, but as there started to be questions. But all of this was in 2018. I had almost a pre-written story thinking that when they finally did his review, they were going to kind of quietly and subtly push him out the door. But and this has been the frustrating thing, all of these things that the Observer's investigative team have been digging up are fascinating, but they don't appear to be why he was pushed out. And
Well, how do we know that?
well, the timing. I mean, maybe it sort of sat in his file, but again, they decided there was not grounds to suspend him or discipline him.
And how can that be? Because the allegations are true. It would have put him in violation, clear violation of his contract just weeks after he started, because the contract prohibited him, his spouse, his children, and immediate relatives from activity that, quote, creates either an actual or potential conflict of interest. This isn't a conflict of interest?
Well, that's what the CMS attorney said, right?
Yeah,
That it was
which
not.
which is surprising. And again, you have to think, if you're the school board and you've just hired this guy, even if it's technically not a problem, That is just not a
Well,
good
wait
look.
a minute. What it technically?
Perception, right?
It says his spouse, children, immediate relatives from activity that creates either an actual or potential conflict of interest. If his son works for a company that he's now hired to do something that some other company is already doing, that pretty much ties the line to I'm doing this because my son works for the company. Isn't that a conflict of interest?
I think that you guys are going to have potentially the Observer reporters on at some point, and I don't know if they were able to get that lawyer's report. Sometimes
You
legal
couldn't
advice
because-
is confidential.
And this is the problem.
Right.
That would be it's legal advice, but it's also, you could say, a personnel record, because the state has this broad law that says you can't get anything that might be about an employee sneezing or something. You can't get access to it. And so it inhibits our ability to know about these kinds of
And
things.
one of the things that they found, going back even further to his previous districts, they found in 2014 when he was in Washington County Public Schools in Maryland, he had an arrangement with a company, and then that summer his son got an internship with that company. And this is kind of the allegation of the story, which is very long and complex, is that even if I don't think they found any documentable evidence that he clearly crossed a legal line, but that he has a history of dancing awfully close to it, of having kind of chummy relationships.
Well, the Observer also, after reviewing hundreds of pages of school district documents obtained through public records requests and uncovered other examples of what appear to be conflicts of interest. I don't know that they went into what exactly they were. Maybe you can tell us what they were, because I think he was paid $8,000
Right.
for a nonprofit business that helps product vendors get FaceTime with schools. And he was involved in getting FaceTime or having FaceTime with these vendors, evidently, according to some at CMS, at the expense of meeting with department heads.
Right, and that's one of the allegations of the whistleblower letter. And I should note that Brian Schultz did go on and leave CMS shortly after this, not surprisingly when you've blown the whistle on your boss. But he said that the normal process is for the people who are actually deep, for instance, for the chief academic officer to be the one who does the groundwork on the contract, and that Clayton Wilcox, as superintendent, was stepping in. And he was involved with this group called the Education Research and Development Institute. And I looked at their website, and they tout it as a chance for the people who really know this, the school officials, to review products and provide feedback and make sure that they're getting high-quality stuff. But it is, again, there were fees paid for him to attend as a consultant. There were travel expenses paid. And again, apparently not a violation of the law, although this is being, I think, teased out in a number of locations around the country. And the company itself is now saying, instead of paying the superintendents directly, we'll make a donation to the charity of their choice.
So we don't know if this played into the sudden and inexplicable jettisoning of Clayton Wilcox.
We have one board member who said it did not,
Okay.
and then the rest wouldn't talk.
But he was dismissed without severance pay, with time on his contract for which he was not compensated, and he just walked into the sunset quietly and said nothing.
And he was suspended before he resigned.
So are these allegations that the Observer has uncovered going to be investigated by the school system or the school board, or are they moot because the alleged perpetrator is no longer employed?
My sense is that the Observer has spent a lot of time documenting what the school system already knew. And I think this really does, again, this points back to the board.
Yes.
Why did they hire him? Why did they...
As I said when this all came down, and I'm going to say it again, they brought him in. We knew nothing about him till the moment they announced his arrival. His predecessor was dismissed once again under a cloud of complete and total secrecy. We still don't know why Heath Morrison was dismissed, clearly. We don't know why Clayton Wilcox was dismissed. All of this goes on under the aegis of a school board that pretty much hasn't changed all that much over this time. Aren't they to blame for all of this? Shouldn't their competency be called into question over all of this?
Well, what I will say is that one of the primary jobs of the school board is to hire and supervise the superintendent. They have two direct reports, the superintendent and the legal counsel, who said this was okay. So, yes, they picked one, and then they decided he was not the right one. And because they were split on that, they kind of leaked like a rotten roof on Heath Morrison. They were unanimous on Clayton Wilcox. And because of that, it's been very hard. There's sort of all these little things out there that board members are telling people that there's no big smoking gun. This was sort of an accumulation of things. But I don't think anybody really knows whether to believe them on that. And I say this, these are people that I think are decent people and, trying to do the right thing.
But are they competent? I mean, you've been covering the schools for forever. Are they competent?
What I will say is that they have had a really difficult time doing that primary job of getting and keeping a good superintendent, and they have shown that they will withhold or mislead if they believe it's in the interest of the district.
I'm sure this is not an easy job to be a part-time school board member, but is this something that other school boards around the country have trouble doing? Finding good, honest, reliable, competent superintendents and keeping them? Or do all school boards have trouble with due diligence?
Superintendent churn and superintendents kind of going down in flames, that's a national thing.
Okay.
It's not unique to CMS, but we've kind of, and I think one of the reasons, we talked about at the time that they jumped on Ernest Winston so quickly, even though he did not have a lot of qualifications on paper, was that they had to be worried about the quality of applicants that they were going to get and the community's trust in the board to pick the right one. So they went with a known quantity who is, whatever else, he's a person of integrity, I think.
When these school superintendents go down in flames elsewhere in the country, is it because they can't deliver on what they promised, the golden child patina has worn off, or is it because of things like hiring your son's company?
Well, there have been scandals, and I don't have, a national registry of superintendent fiascos ready to rattle off, but some of them have been worse than this. But again, and this whole network of people who want to influence school spending and the people who control school spending is really murky. There are a whole lot of ways that you have companies that are trying to stay within the law but say, let us get our clients in front of you.
I thought one of the interesting things about that reporting was the fact that there was all this talk of the procurement and vending policies changing, that is, in essence, the superintendent taking charge of it, and it just kind of happened. It didn't seem like there was really much of a fight to stop that. Did you interpret it that way?
To stop that particular contract?
No, just in general, there were allegations that the procurement used to go more through, I guess, a committee or a vetting of experts, and that the superintendent was not directly involved until the very end in taking a recommendation. And the way I read the reporting was he was more on the front lines of listening to proposals and meeting with people, which typically, I think there was an expert quoted saying, that's not normal because a superintendent doesn't have the knowledge typically, because they're doing all these other things.
And what I do know is that there were a large number of people who were in his fairly top ranks who were concerned about his leadership. And some of them were talking to me off the record. Nobody was going on the record. I don't know how much they were talking to board members. It's really risky to go to someone and say, my boss is no good. And especially, I think, at the point that they pretty much affirmed him in January, there was a sense that the board, for better or for worse, just decided we can't lose another superintendent. Right. We have to hold our nose and live with whatever he does. And something changed in the next few months.
And that's the other important note on this, right? They get this letter with all these allegations. They're all bubbling, and hearing about them at the board meetings. They gave him a $37,000 raise?
Yeah.
2-year extension.
And amidst all of this, right? And then...
Well, and to your point, Mike, you're talking about, so he's gone. Will there be any more follow-up because the board knew all this? But going back to what I was just talking about, I think there are all kinds of policy questions that the board needs to examine clearly, because whatever Clayton Wilcox did or didn't do, the systems just aren't working.
Right.
Well,
and
I think,
to your point, he must have found some loopholes.
Yes.
In a lot of their policies. Yeah.
And I think the biggest systems that aren't working here is the board's oversight. I mean, I think the questions that have yet to be answered as a result of this discovery is, what is the board doing?
Well, and I think it's really important to note that if you're at home sitting there pounding the table and saying, man, what's wrong with this board? You need to vote this year.
Yeah.
There is a
big turnover.
The
Big
three
turnover.
at-large members' seats are up.
Yeah.
2 of them, including the chair, Mary McRae, have said they're not coming back. One, Elise Dashew, is running again. There are 13 candidates. It's a lot of research to do, but people love to gripe about the board, but then they tend to not bother to vote.
All right, moving on. A Twitter war has been raging between Governor Roy Cooper and Republican State Senate Leader Phil Berger over who is to blame for the lack of North Carolina teacher pay raises. This is all about the budget still, isn't it?
Yes.
That's what this is all about.
Yes.
Both the governor and the Republican state Senate want teacher pay raises. Let's be clear about that. But Cooper tweeted on Tuesday that legislators have, quote, lied, cheated, and taken a vacation while teachers work without raises. Berger responded that Cooper has vetoed every teacher raise approved by the General Assembly. That's because he's vetoed the budget. So what is the truth here?
The truth is they still don't like each other. They still can't reach an agreement, and they're still pointing fingers. I mean, that's the truth.
This is just bald politics on both sides. Every day, every reporter in this state gets one press release from one entity that says, that guy's a real bad dude. And then the real bad dude says, he's the worst dude. Every day. And I'll say this, it's not good for the state of North Carolina. You could do this on teacher pay, highway funding, infrastructure needs, a whole host of really important public safety dollars. All of it is hung up because Roy Cooper wants Medicaid expansion. The General Assembly's not going to do it. And so as a result, we've seen gridlock. Now,
what are we, Nick, 4 months past having a budget?
Yeah.
Okay.
I was getting the rap sign.
The spinning finger of wrap it up.
Just trying to move it along here. The other lesson to be learned here is that I want everybody to hear this out loud. Twitter is not your friend. Stop using it.
I agree, Mike.
But I think they think it is. I think their supporters go, yeah.
Okay, after years of enrollment increases, CMS has seen its first significant decrease in enrollment in years. Why?
Well, this is a trend that's been building. We have seen them go to kind of constant growth down to leveling off. We had a tiny bit of growth 2 years ago. Last year, they initially said they had a tiny bit of growth and then later quietly revised it and said we were down by 7 students. That's as flat as you can get.
Right.
This year, they were saying they'd gain about 200, and in fact, they lost 465, which is still less than 0.5%.
It was tiny.
Right.
Because there are 148,000 students in the system.
147, I think.
Well, one and change.
Yeah.
So I rounded it up. That's what I was taught to do in math.
It was 146 and change.
Remember,
but
Mike,
I'm
Twitter
looking
is not your friend.
Maybe it's 140. Yes, 146 and change. So it makes it 147,000. Jeez. Because I'm rounding it up. All
Math matters. It's education.
But the loss, evidently is to rising charter school enrollment and what is happening around the country, a baby bust. Is that right?
Right.
And Associate Superintendent Akeisha Craven-Howell called the move to charter schools something that was easy to spot.
We continue to experience competition with schools outside of the district. Certainly we had 3 new charters open in Mecklenburg County this school year.
So the school system had anticipated growth in enrollment this year. If this is easy to spot, how did they miss projections?
Well, you never get it exactly.
Okay.
I mean, again, a difference of 600 is probably pretty small, but it's always the school-by-school variations. You still have areas like South Charlotte that they are not worried about losing students. They're gaining students, and they're worried. And
Right.
the northern suburbs say we're still growing, and we don't have any construction plans in our future.
But as I understand it, the drop-off in enrollment would have been even greater had it not been for Hispanic students. The rise in the number of Hispanic students, which now I believe does it eclipse. The white and black enrollment is decreasing. Hispanic enrollment is rising, but Hispanics have caught up to whites in the school system. Is that right?
It's a difference of like a couple hundred more whites, essentially the same.
We'll come back and talk more about that because this has to do with the resegregation of the schools as well. We'll come back and talk about that and area elections, which took place this week, and many other things. As much as we can squeeze in all the news that fits on the News Roundup. It's Charlotte Talks on WFAE. Support for Charlotte Talks comes from WFAE members and Taylor Richards and Conger, hosting 2 trunk shows today and tomorrow at the Phillips Place store, featuring Isaiah for men and Peter Cohen for women. Details at trcstyle.com. And Charlotte Radiology, with the goal of raising awareness for Breast Cancer Awareness Month this October and encouraging women to make breast health a priority. The News Roundup will continue at 10 o'clock on 1A. Joshua Johnson and his roundtable of reporters talk about Elizabeth Warren going on the offense, the NBA going on the defense, and the White House declaring war on the impeachment inquiry. There's been a lot of big moves in the news this week, including those of Simone Biles, who made gymnastics history. They'll take a look at Around the Nation, the news around the nation, coming up in 20 minutes at 10 o'clock on 1A, and we will continue our look into local and regional news in just 30 seconds.
Behind every All Things Considered headline, there's a deeper story.
That's the thing that really jumped out at us, that time and again prosecutors were dismissing gun charges, particularly in Mecklenburg. In Mecklenburg, they were dismissing more than 2/3 of gun charges.
All Things Considered gets beneath the surface of the day's news. Listen weekday afternoons from 4 to 6:30 on 90.7 WFAE.
It's Charlotte Talks on WFAE and WFHE. I'm Mike Collins. The local news roundup starring Nick Oxner from WBTV News, Jonathan Lowe from Spectrum News, Nick Oxner, I've already said your name, Eric Spanberg.
He's still here.
He's still here. Managing editor from the Charlotte Business Journal, and Andos Helms, our education reporter here at WFAE News. This rise in Hispanic enrollment, the decline in black and white enrollment at the Charlotte Mecklenburg schools is a highlight of the fact that we are resegregating our school systems. Is that right?
Yeah, and it's a different kind of resegregation than when it was just black and white, but we now have 21 schools that are majority Hispanic. That's out of 175. The highest is 85% Hispanic at Montclair Elementary. We have 74 of those 175 schools are more than 90% non-white, and a little over half of our black and Hispanic schools go to those extremely students of color and often very high poverty schools. 27% of the students are white, but we have 34 majority white schools, and a little more than half of the white students go to those majority white schools.
You also reported this week that CMS is warning families that their kids must have lunch money unless they've qualified for free lunches. Parents received robocalls this week telling them that, quote, as of this week, students will no longer be allowed to go into the negative to purchase food. I question the vocabulary and the grammar there, and that's a little concerning since it's coming from the schools. But is this something new, or do we go through this every single year at the start of the year?
I think we go through it every single year, and because they really don't want. I mean, it's a significant amount of money. It's well over $300,000 in bad lunch debt.
Right.
And the reality is, elementary and middle school kids still are allowed to eat, even though they, I believe, sent that warning to the parents. But in high school, if you don't qualify for a free lunch and you don't bring your money, you don't eat.
And finally, in education this week, it took a while, but the town of Huntersville looked like it was ready to move on their resolution endorsing a separate school district for the northern part of Mecklenburg County. But then the resolution was withdrawn. Why?
They got blowback, and there was a lot of speculation that it was tied to the municipal election. Bottom line is there's a whole lot of little pieces going on that say that CMS is going to have to confront some really tough issues about school construction and bond spending. There are some questions that are being raised about the projects that have already been approved, people who want to revise what they're doing there. That was the big thing in Huntersville, was they were saying having our own district would be a response to not having enough schools. And CMS, speaking of weird communications, on Monday they announced, we're having a special meeting at 3:30 on Tuesday to talk about bond financing. And I started trying to ask people, okay, what's that about? And nobody would answer. And it was not clear that they had met the 48 hours legal notice. And then they said, you know what, never mind, Mary McRae's sick, so we're not going to do it.
Bad week for scheduling press conferences in Charlotte, wasn't it?
That is going around. Must be contagious.
So there were municipal elections, primaries around Charlotte, in the towns around Charlotte, and I think education may have played a role, at least in the Matthews election, where Mayor Paul Bailey got 42% of the vote, and Commissioner John Higdon got 55% of the vote. So he beat the incumbent in the primary, but the two of them will now go to the general. Is that right?
Absolutely, yes. It's the excuse me. The October primaries were really weird because some of them were runoff, and the others there was a primary. But this was a key race because John Higdon is the mayor pro tem in Matthews. He's known Paul Bailey, the current mayor, for 25 years. now running against someone he's known for and served with on that commission for
And
quite
Paul
a while.
was a member of the Charlotte-Mecklenburg School Board, Paul Bailey was, who now advocates separating.
House Bill 514, which allowed cities and towns across North Carolina. He was a major supporter and endorser of that bill to allow them to make their own municipal
So
charters.
if John Higdon got 55%, did the education move play a role in this?
Yeah, he said the deciding factor for him running against Paul Bailey was Paul Bailey supporting and endorsing that bill.
Is this primary an indicator of the outcome of the general, you think?
I think so. I'm going to be watching this one really close. I'm really interested to see how this. I think the turnout, it was only 7.5%, but clearly people supported John Higdon much more significantly than they did Paul Bailey, the incumbent.
There were also election primaries in Mooresville, Statesville, and Hickory. In Mooresville, challenger Angela Carubba Stutz edged out incumbent Miles Atkins, and they both, too, also move on to the November election because the contest eliminated a third candidate. There were several races in Hickory for city council, but one is particularly interesting. Ward 3. Incumbent Danny Seaver was the top vote getter, but the second and third place candidates each received 16 votes.
And
16 votes.
And here's the even more fascinating part about that, Mike. Do you know by law the way you break a tie vote in North Carolina?
Yeah, what is it?
You draw lots. Or you flip a coin. That is statutorily
What do they
how
do?
you
Did
break
they flip a
tie.
coin or did they draw
You flip
straws?
a toy. You just
What do they do?
well,
What
you
did
can,
they
it's
do?
up to the discretion of the
flip a
local
coin to see if
county
you flip a
elections
coin.
board. But it has to be a thing of chance, and that's how you decide.
But I think they are going to do a recount on Monday, which that shouldn't take real long.
And there's one absentee ballot out remaining.
Now, wait a minute. What was the turnout? If only 32 people voted, what was the
Second
turnout?
place. It's
Well,
the
I
second
know.
place.
So what you're saying is more people just said, I'm not voting in that race.
That's the biggest story of all of these primaries
Yeah.
from this week across the whole state. Raleigh, Fayetteville,
Absolutely.
here, all of the local towns, is how low the turnout
It's
was.
very, and I think we've, over the course of almost an hour, talked about some significant things that are going to, significant reasons that people really need to, as Ann said, research your ballot and know, because Charlotte City Council, School Board, all these municipal elections are happening, in 4 short weeks. There's going to be some significant
And people tend to
races.
just vote in presidential races and not local races.
Okay, Nick Oxner loves open governmental meetings. He's been successful in
Guilty.
pressing a lot of entities to be more transparent. And this week you started getting answers that you've been looking for months from Mecklenburg County to find out how much attorneys representing the county were being paid to defend county commissioners in an active lawsuit. Are these outside attorneys that don't work full-time for the county?
Correct.
How much are they making?
Yes. Well, so far they've billed in 2 months $44,000.
Okay.
I rounded up.
What is the lawsuit
Yeah, and
about?
that's the thing here, and this is my colleague David Hodges who did this reporting, is the county commissioners are facing a lawsuit that they violated the open meetings law by negotiating the budget or portions of the budget in secret. They did it over email that no one knew about and then fought it. So the Mecklenburg County Republican Party, sensing a win against an all-Democrat Mecklenburg County Board of Commissioners, filed an open meetings lawsuit alleging they violated the Open Meetings Act, which could invalidate the decisions they made. And so the county hired Womble, what used to be Womble Carlisle, now Womble Bond Dixon, Jim Cooney, one of the best litigators in the state of North Carolina, to defend that action. And so we wanted to know, how much are we paying for this? And so they were originally telling us that they gave us all sorts of invalid excuses as to why they wouldn't give us that information. We finally did. So far, it's $44,000. Surprisingly, the top litigator in North Carolina only billing $400 an hour. Now we know why he didn't.
Which was a
want it.
discounted rate, right? It's what
Significant.
is-
I was shocked. I expected it to be at least double that. Now we know
Okay.
why they wanted to keep it secret.
Well, as long as we're talking transparency, last week county commissioners voted 7-2 for a resolution that sets guidelines for how the county and a revamped Arts and Science Council would spend tax money that would come in from a 1/4-cent sales tax hike that voters will consider in November. However, the ASC would go from being an organization that gets all of its money from donations to one that receives tax dollars, but they would remain a nonprofit not subject to the state's open meetings and records laws. How do you achieve transparency under those circumstances?
You can say it's not subject to the open meetings law, but that doesn't mean it actually isn't. And if it's receiving government funding, it's subject to the Public Records Act. I have bad news for them.
Okay.
But you might have to fight that pretty hard in court. I remember the Observer trying to get information from.
I would hire a lawyer and
yeah.
file that lawsuit
Yeah.
all day.
So this is something else they haven't worked out in advance of the vote.
Yeah, this whole process has been very much one
Floppy
of
rollout?
Yes, thank you. That's exactly the phrase I was looking for. And we're seeing more of that. One of the other things they're going to do, Mike, is put county commission and city council members on the board and also have them appoint other board members.
So it will definitely be subject to the public,
Yes.
just so we're clear.
Thank you.
And let me say this. The county, and to some extent the city, but especially Mecklenburg County, has a profound and deep-rooted misunderstanding of the Public Records Act and transparency. They're not interested.
Okay. Meanwhile, you're reporting that even as the city and the Panthers ownership are talking about bringing Major League Soccer to town, CRVA, the Charlotte Regional Visitors Authority, says they're out of the loop. Should they be in the loop?
Well, they're the CRVA, again, the entity that spends most of the tourism tax dollars generated in Mecklenburg County goes to them. So, again, my colleague David Hodges went to their board meeting this week where the president of the CRVA briefed the board and said, we've not been involved in the discussions with David Tepper over funding for a new stadium or renovations to Bank of America for a soccer team and soccer stadium, which struck us as a little surprising since that would be the board that spends most of those dollars.
And
But not only that, Nick, I'm sorry, go ahead.
So, no, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say one thing that's really interesting about that, a nuance, is Ron Kimball, the former city manager, who is now part of CRVA, traditionally negotiated all these deals for the city, Mike, with the Panthers and the Hornets and everybody else. So the fact that the CRVA is not involved, even with Ron Kimball there, is very surprising.
Well, CRVA CEO Tom Murray says he has to build back trust with the city of Charlotte, and he later walked back that statement, saying it's about building relationships with new members of the team. What is he talking about?
Well, we have a new city manager who hadn't always been there, who's installed a lot of his own staff. I think it's more telling that he tried to walk it back after he realized a reporter was in the room when he said that.
Mecklenburg County Commission is considering 3 new affordable housing programs focused on helping the county's poorest or most at-risk populations. One is called Mech Home. It offers a short-term rental subsidy to people making less than 30% of the area's median household income. That would cost $6.3 million. The Link is another program which would connect chronically homeless seniors and people with disabilities to temporary housing, and it would cost $2.1 million. And the third is Program for Domestic Violence Victims, whose cost is as yet unknown. If they go through with all this, where does this money come from? Does it come from the $50 million?
No, it's in the budget.
This money is in the county budget, was added this year to the county
They
budget.
have $11 million, and they haven't quite. This doesn't quite use up all of that.
Remember, this is part of the reason that you did not get a revenue-neutral budget this year.
Okay. So this week saw a crack in the veneer of Republican support for President Trump. They began to break ranks over his decision to pull troops out of Syria and leave the Kurds, who had been our allies, to fend for themselves. South Carolina's Lindsey Graham, one of the president's staunchest supporters, condemned the move strongly, but not North Carolina Senator Thom Tillis.
At this point, I'm giving the president the benefit of the doubt. We'll go back next week. I'm sure we'll have a classified briefing, and then I'll have a better access to the facts that he may have used to make that decision.
So the president said he got a promise from the Turks that they would not target civilians or Christians, but almost immediately they launched what appeared to be indiscriminate attacks. And Republicans have traditionally supported allies and have been reluctant to pull troops out of anywhere. Why is this okay? Why is he giving the benefit of the doubt to the president?
Well, I think because
the election?
Yes.
Yeah, he has a primary challenger who says he's not pro-Trump enough.
Yes, his primary, who's trying to run to Tillis's right. Tillis used to be a pretty moderate guy, has now run even more to the right, and there you have it.
And remember this, Mike, when Trump came to Fayetteville last month, Thom Tillis took the stage. There were a fair number of boos heard. I think that's a real big bellwether for his difficulties in his primary.
So Tillis also dismissed the whistleblower's complaint about the president's call to the president of Ukraine. He called the House investigation a waste. At a town hall meeting with farmers in Monroe, he was asked about the impeachment inquiry and whether it is appropriate for Donald Trump to ask for a foreign government for a favor, in this case to investigate Trump's political rival Joe Biden.
I'm going to leave it to the president to make that decision. What I will tell you, I don't think it's right to go through a process right now that's based on the facts or distracting away. The impeachment inquiry now apparently didn't raise to a level that the speaker thought that it should have a vote on the floor to move forward.
So in truth, it doesn't need a vote on the floor to move forward. The Constitution prescribes nothing about process, nothing at all. And evidently, every single time that the Congress has embarked down the road to impeachment, the rules have been completely different. People keep saying this over and over again. Do they just hope by denying that fact that they can?
Well,
pull the
I
wool
think
over
Tillis
people's
was
eyes?
just using the Republican talking point. He was just saying the party line.
And if you look at this High Point University poll that came out about 2 weeks ago, his approval weighting right now is 27%. But the interesting thing is that only 38% of North Carolinians disapprove of the way he's handling his job. So a little over a third is not many.
So former Republican Governor Pat McCrory back in the news this week and got into the back and forth between the NBA and China. The general manager of the Houston Rockets tweeted that he supported the pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong. The Rockets franchise immediately distanced itself because evidently Rockets paraphernalia are the biggest paraphernalia sales in China. They love the Rockets in China. Well, not anymore because they've been pulled off television. They pulled all the merchandise. So the NBA also backed away from all this, saying, whoa, now, come on now, we like China. I'm paraphrasing here, just so anybody knows that's a paraphrase. I'm not making fun. Then the NBA issued statements trying to balance an apology while defending free expression, and that's when McCrory accused the NBA of hypocrisy. Why?
Well, I think there are two reasons. The first is a lot of Republicans and Democrats were mad at the NBA for their response. I think in the case of
To the HB, of the response to China?
To China,
Okay.
yes.
China,
The second part is House Bill 2. I'll put some money in the jar. Pat McCrory is still furious about the NBA pulling the All-Star game out of Charlotte in 2017.
And
because
isn't
of
he
HB2.
right in this case about hypocrisy? I mean, it's the same situation, and they decided there's money to be made in China, so we'll not penalize them. We'll
Got
not
a
talk
point?
badly about them.
He's got a point, yes.
Okay. And finally, the Panthers, who are 3-2 on the season, are going to play in London, England this Sunday at 9:30 in the morning. Set your clocks against Tampa Bay. Does this mean anything for the city, this exposure in London? Okay. Cam Newton has not been present in the stadium for the last 3 games. He's not going to London. Is there more to this than meets the eye?
I don't know. I
I
mean,
was kind of surprised that they said sitting on a plane was a problem. Although maybe if you're that big and you're trying to sit on a
the
plane.
altitude.
Then we spied him at the airport.
A shout out to my colleague Joe Bruno. Do not start drinking before 10 a.m. if you're going to a bar.
All right. Nick Oxner, Eric Spanberg, Jonathan Lowe, and Doss Helms. Thank you all for the hour.